I am half Guatemalan. My mother was Guatemalan. I spent many years of my life in Guatemala. And con los hermanos aquí de habla hispana, con su permiso, me pidieron que yo diera esta charla en inglés, pero mañana en español. Entonces, paciencia, por favor. What I'd like to do this morning is share some biblical foundations that hopefully might be illuminating for your ministry. And it really is a privilege for me to be here. I'm a prof. I teach at Wheaton College. And just to listen to the stories and the ministries, it's a privilege. So I commend you. And hopefully what we'll look at this morning might be helpful for you. I'm a Bible prof. I'm an Old Testament prof. So we're going to do some Bible. I hear that this is kind of Bible and compassionate stuff. So you've got a Bible either in your hand, and if you don't, may the Lord forgive you, but in the pew, and I'll make it really easy. I'll be in Genesis. That's the first book. And the passage that we'll focus on is in chapter 12. And what I'd like to do, again, I'm writing blind, so I think this is working. Yes. What I'd like to do is talk about some foundations for the kind of ministry that you do. And the core of it, I would suggest to you, is being a blessing. That to me is the mission of the people of God. And we'll focus on the call of Abram in chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Is that on the screen? Okay, all right. And there's an interesting geographical movement, and if you know the text at all, Abram is in Ur of the Chaldees, which would have been in the area of ancient Babylon, southeastern Iraq today, would have gone up to Haran, which would have been on the Syrian border, Syrian-Turkish border, then he comes down into Canaan. But what's fascinating about that, and I won't elaborate on it today, is that what God does to establish his mission in the world is to call a man to migrate. And here is the father of the faith as a migrant. He walks, literally, hundreds of miles, not knowing where he's supposed to end up. And he will begin his mission as a migrant in Canaan, who never owns any land except for a burial plot for his wife. And so the migrant, Abram, becomes the father of our faith. And really, the beacon that can teach us so much about what we are supposed to do. So I could go on about that, but I won't. What I want to look at more is the content of what he's asked to do and why he's asked to do it. And then I want to close with our mission and the pieces of that. Now, when we look at the choice of Abram, I want to kind of retell you kind of the biblical story, and all this will be review, hopefully. But I want to begin to set the stage for what he does and why he does it, and what he's called to do. Now, the creation of humanity, that's easy, chapters 1 and 2. We all know this. All humans are created in the image of God, which tells us that all humans have great worth. But what most people miss is that it's tied into ruling and subduing the earth. So it's not only about human worth, it's about human potential. All kinds of implications for immigration if you put your mind to it. But God also creates this beautiful world, which is good. Everything is functioning like it's supposed to. Everything is in the place it's supposed to be. And then he creates this garden, and there he'll put the man and the woman. Everything is very good. In fact, that's what he says at the end of the creation of humanity is, and God saw that it was very good. But once you move into chapter 3, things go desperately wrong. And when we ask ourselves, what is the essence of the sin of humanity? What is the temptation that grabs their heart, that is at the core of all temptations of humans? It's the temptation to be like God. Chapter 3, verse 5. Now, what's interesting about that is that they were like God. They were made in his image. And now they want to be like him in ways that weren't appropriate. Now, humans want to play the role of God. And as we look at Scripture and all of human history, when we see humans playing out God, how do we do it? Unlike the God of creation who blesses and puts everything in order to give life and mission, as we'll see in a little bit, when humans desire to be like God, we dominate, we exclude, we eliminate. We have all kinds of plots to become number one. When humans desire to be like God, they do it to be number one at the expense of everybody else. This can be in our individual lives. All of us have this core of ambition in our heart. Where did that come from? You can see it playing itself out in terms of racial relationships, where an entire race will desire to be number one and be better than all the other ones. And how do you do that? You segregate, you kill, you incarcerate, you mock, all these things playing itself out racially and playing itself out even as we watch what's going on in Eastern Europe internationally with nation states. This is the human reality. Now, when this is going to get set up in chapter 2, God says something that we often don't think very much about. He tells them, on the day you eat of the fruit of the tree that's in the middle of the garden, you will surely die. Now, in the original language, it's a very forceful way of saying things. Literally, if you were to translate it, it would be, dying, you will die. Now, English translations won't go that way because that just sounds weird in English. So what the English versions will do, will say surely or something like this. But what he's saying is when you sin, and in chapter 3 we find out what that sin is, you will surely die. But we go into chapter 3 and they sin and nobody dies. Have you thought about that? They don't die. Well, someone will say, well, but they died spiritually because Paul in Romans says, but I'm not in Romans. And Romans won't be written for millennia. What does it mean in the story? Because nobody dies. The only one who dies is the animal who is killed by God to cover their nakedness. Now, they are separated from God. That's true. And they can't go back. But there's a funny twist to the story because when the man names the woman, he calls her Eve because she would be the mother of all the living. Isn't that odd? In chapter 4, verse 1, she gives birth to a son. And she thanks God for helping her give life. No one's died. But then death does come. Cain kills Abel. Fratricide. And then when he is condemned to wander, he says, I can't do this because if they find me, they will kill me. In the end of chapter 4, Lamech boasts about how many people he can kill. Chapter 5, you have this refrain, and he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. And it's not death by violence, it's death by old age and probably disease. And then in chapter 6, that interesting line, the earth was full of violence. There it is. And God sends a flood, and everybody dies. Except for a family and some animals. You see what we learn in chapter 2 when he says, On the day you eat of the fruit of the tree that's in the middle of the garden, you will surely die. What he is telling us when you begin to appreciate the story is death will be unleashed in your existence in ways that you can't even imagine. You will kill each other. Even brothers. You will die from getting old, disease, or I will take your life. When we talk about ministry, what we need to appreciate is that we live in a world of death. Death is all around us, and this is where we're called to be. So with all the death and the darkness in the early chapters of Genesis, are there any glimpses of hope? Well, there are. You have a person like Abel, and then what you have after Abel has been killed, toward the end of the chapter, you have the birth of Seth. And with him, people begin to call on the name of the Lord, but then he's gone. We have Enoch, who's mentioned, but he's taken away. And then we have Noah, the most righteous man on the earth, and even his name from the verb nuach, which means rest, he is supposed to give humanity rest, and it says this in 5:29. But the last time we see Noah is he's passed out drunk in his tent. His nakedness uncovered, whatever that might mean, by his son. The great hope of humanity has failed miserably. So now to whom do we turn? And it gets worse. If you were to go into chapters 10 and 11, there's an interesting sequence, and I want you to listen carefully. When you go into chapter 10, you'll see at verse 5 and 20 and 30 and 31, it says this. These are the sons of Shem, or Ham, divided in their territories according to their languages. That's interesting, because in chapter 11, they have one language. So how does that work? This is where you need to follow me. At the end of chapter 9, Noah will have a word for each of his sons. 3 sons. And then in chapter 10, the question would be, so what happened to all the sons? And it'll work you through all the descendants. It's like a massive footnote. Because the question is, well, how did all this happen? Chapter 11. It will explain to you where all those languages came from. But you need to see even deeper what's happening. You know the story of Babel? Humanity has come together to build a city. Do you remember what it says? They're going to build a tower that reaches to the heavens. We will be like God. In the divine humor, God comes down to see what they're doing. In their mind, the tower will reach to the heavens. In God's sight, he has to come down and, now what are these people doing here? Human pretension, divine perspective. And then he scatters them with all the languages. And what chapter 11 has told you is where all the nations come from. All the nations of the earth are born at Babel. Babel is our mother. This is why every nation on the earth will be proud of its history that it'll fabricate in large measure. We'll be socialized into this by national anthems, pledges of allegiance, holidays, parades. This is something you will see in every country of the world. Even in Guatemala, un país pequeño, the arrogance of us all. Babel is our mother. And if you go to the book of Revelation, humanity gathers one more time at the final Babylon. Our history begins at Babel and it will end at Babel. A world of death and arrogance, of disease and killing, and all kinds of darkness. In that kind of world, what do we do? When you move into chapter 12, what you begin to appreciate is God cannot call one of the nations of the earth. How can he? All of them were born at Babel out of human arrogance, in rebellion against him. So God doesn't choose a nation, he creates one. He begins with a man and the miraculous birth of the children that will follow. And bit by bit, he begins to create a people that should be different. You see the echo of chapter 1, where the promise of a seed, and part of being having the blessing is to have children. And so he says to Abram, you will be a great nation. I will make you that. You will multiply. You will be the ideal human people. And I will make your name great. Oh, don't you hear the echo of chapter 11? Let us make a name for ourselves. Chapter 11, verse 4. But God says, I will make your name great. But it will be a greatness not based on your arrogance and all your achievements. You will be great as you obey me. You will become great as you fulfill the mission that I will give you. And then in chapter 12, he tells them that they should be a blessing to all the nations or the clans or the families, depends on your English translation, of the earth. Now, what is fascinating about that, if you were to go back to chapter 10 and how humanity is divided, these are the descendants of Ham, according to their clans, families. That's the same word that you find in chapter 12. All those clans and families, all the peoples of the world that were born at Babel, all the ones that raised their fists against God, those are the ones you are to bless. Don't you see how chapter 12 now makes sense? We are to bless a humanity that has cursed God in all of their clans and families and nations. This is what we are called to do. If you look at the structure of Genesis 12, in verse 2, you have this idea, I will bless you, I will bless you, I will bless you. And then he says, and you will be a blessing. It can also be translated as imperative. That's kind of the Hebrew nerd thing. That's the prof speaking. But you see the sequence. I will bless you. Now, be a blessing. You cannot give away what you do not know. You cannot share what you have not lived. You cannot testify unless you have a relationship. I will bless you. Now, be a blessing. Fascinating, isn't it? And then I want you to look at chapter 12, verse 3. Are you looking at your Bible? Some of you are looking at me. No, look at the Bible. And I want you to look very carefully what it says. Chapter 12, verse 3. I've got to get there myself. It says this.
I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. Look at it, the grammar. I will bless those who bless you, but whoever. The expectation is, as we do our mission, the peoples around us will bless us. It's a plural. But whosoever is a singular. The expectation is that we will be cursed. That is the expectation that you should await in your ministry. People will curse you. And let me explain what that is in just a moment. You should expect that. But as we do our work and our mission, greater will be the number who will bless us as they receive the blessing of which we are the channel. Let me take it further. In the Hebrew, actually, when it says, whoever curses you, I will curse, those are actually two different verbs. The first verb in Hebrew is to treat as minimal, to menospreciar, as we would say in Spanish. To treat as less than. Those who disdain you, I will curse. Those are different verbs. The expectation that we should have is that we will be disdained. We will be shoved aside. We will be considered less than. As we do our mission, that is part of our calling. And God will curse them. Because ultimately they're not disdaining us, they're disdaining the God who has sent us. But what you see in chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, is that the people of God have as the reason for their existence is to be a blessing to the world. There is no other reason for us to be here. God did not save you for yourself. He saved us for the world. There is no other reason. In all of the holy circles that we see in our churches, and all the praises, which are all very self-directed, and all the monuments to ourselves are a mockery of the mission of God. We are here for everybody else, which is what makes this gathering so important. But this all begs the question, what does it mean, this word blessing? This is one of those Christian words. So what does it mean to bless people? It's, you bless them. No, but what does it actually mean? You bless them. Well, Genesis will actually tell us what it means. In fact, if you go back to chapter 1, and I give you the verses there, he blesses humanity in chapter 1, verse 28, but he blesses the animals in verse 22. And the blessing in chapter 1 is the blessing of life, progeny, the animals multiplying, children, the good things of material life. This is the blessing of God in chapter 1. And if you follow the narrative in Genesis, this is what you see. Wherever these patriarchs go, the flocks increase. They find water. There's food. Children are born. They are blessing the world in all of its physical realities. This is part of the mission of God, is to share the blessing, the material blessing of God, of life flourishing. But then you also see its spiritual blessing. Chapter 2, 1 to 3. He sets aside the seventh day and he blesses it. And now we begin to see that the blessing of God is also spiritual. And if you follow the narrative, you see it. Right after the call of Abram, the first thing he does is what? Build an altar. He begins to call the name of Yahweh in Canaan. And over they build altars. They call on the name of God. Abraham will pray for Sodom and Gomorrah. They will confess when they are asked, how did this happen? Oh, Yahweh has blessed me. When Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for his son, what does he say? Well, our God has blessed Abraham. They confess their God. They worship their God in plain sight. It's a spiritual blessing that they share and they vocalize and they make public display in their worship. And what is fascinating is that the others begin to see. And I give you a list of passages. Abimelech, it's about water. The shepherds of Isaac find water. And Abimelech says, we see that you are blessed by Yahweh. They begin to see. Laban, multiplying sheep with Jacob. Pharaoh. That's an interesting story. Have you ever thought about that story of Joseph? He will eventually bring his family reunification, we could call it, at the end of Genesis. Brings his family into Egypt and sets them in a certain part of the delta. They're looking for food. Oh, and Joseph saves Egypt from starvation. It's a material blessing. But the text also tells us that the Egyptians despised shepherds. What was the father of Joseph? A shepherd. And when Joseph presents his father to the Pharaoh, was he embarrassed? Was he ashamed? And the old man, he will put his hand on Pharaoh and he will bless Pharaoh. A poor shepherd on the verge of starvation who's migrated to Egypt will bless the most powerful man on the earth. And Pharaoh begins to see it. You see the beautiful development and flow of the passages in Genesis. It tells us why we're here. It explains to us and it incarnates for us the very mission of God. And as I listen, don't you see how you are doing this? In the prisons? In the reconciliation? You are doing the material things in the name of Jesus. You're incarnating the mission of God, and that's why you're here. And they will see and confess that you live and breathe and work for the Holy One.